In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at who fought during World War One. Learning intention is we're going to explore the traditional narrative of World War One. Success criteria being to identify countries involved in the war, to explain the origins of the traditional narrative of the war, and to challenge the traditional narrative of World War One. So, quick starter task, what I want you to do is have a look at the 3 propaganda posters in front of you. What I want you to do is infer what these images suggest about who fought for Britain in World War One. So remember, in an inference question, you need to state what you can infer, so what you can see or tell, and then explain how you can infer that. So pause the video here, just a very quick inference. What can you infer from these images and why? When you're ready to move on, press play. So hopefully from these posters you will have picked up some sort of idea of empire. We've got the one on the left here which is talking about being enlisted, and it's the Quebec Rifles. Now some of you might have picked up that Quebec is part of Canada and Canada was part of the British Empire. The third one, with the lions, are literally saying the empire needs men, calling upon people from the empire, and it says there the overseas states. So it's asking people from around the empire to join. And then finally in the middle there you've got different soldiers of the British Empire. So the link here is the inference about empire. So next, what I want you to do is, without Googling, without looking and cheating, because I'm not testing you, is I want you to write a list of which countries you think fought in World War One. Now I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes. I want you to pause it and then see how many you can come up with in that 2 or 3 minutes. So pause the video here, do your list, see how many you come up with, doesn't matter if they're right or wrong, and then press play when you're ready to move on, and we'll go through some of those countries that were involved. So, I imagine you'll have got some countries down. I imagine you'd have had some of the big players like France, Germany, Russia, Britain, the ones that we've looked at in the past. But there was more than that. Now I'm going to show you a whole group of countries. Not all of them were directly involved with fighting. Some of them were just involved in the war in different ways. So I'm slightly cheating here. But from Africa, there is a whole lot of countries. You can see on the map there that in fact there are very few countries that weren't involved in some way during World War One. Now some of these countries would be with the Triple Entente, and some would have been with the Triple Alliance. But you can see by the map and the number of countries there, massive African involvement during World War One, which might have surprised some of you. North and South America is very similar. Massive involvement in North and South America. Moving on to Asia. Not quite as many countries involved in Asia, but still with the involvement of China, India, Japan, Russia, that's still a massive amount of people. These are huge countries. Then we've got Australasia, loads and loads of the smaller islands involved in the World War One. Obviously Australia as well. Link here being that quite a lot of these are part of the British Empire. So a lot of involvement from Australasia due to the links with Britain and of course with France. Lastly, Europe. Some of the big ones here, obviously Great Britain, Germany, Italy, Russia, France. But then we've got other countries like San Marino, which is really small, being brought in. Malta, part of the British Empire. Countries like Albania, Latvia, Czechoslovakia, all these Baltic countries. Montenegro also being involved. Of course, Serbia as well, where a lot of these issues kicked off in the first place. So, loads and loads of countries being involved in World War One there. Some of those might have been surprises to you. What I want you to do is pause the video here, and I want you to just quickly jot down a short answer to this question. So firstly, why would so many different countries take part in First World War? Hopefully that one will be fairly obvious based on what we've done earlier in the year, and, well, I've already mentioned it a couple of times. And then a question at the bottom, which continent had the highest number of countries involved? So, which continent, Africa, Asia, Europe, North and South America, Australasia, which had the most involved, and why do you think that is? So think about what we've looked at in the past. We've mentioned different events briefly, see if you can remember. So pause the video there, have a go at those two questions, use the map for reference, especially for the second question at the bottom. When you're ready to move on, press play. So, moving quickly on to your next task. Based on what you already know, I'd like you to write me a paragraph to describe what you know about what life was like fighting in World War One. So I know lots of you have touched on this in English in particular, so I want you to tell me what you know about what life was like in World War One. Try and tell me how you know this information. So if you've learned things from watching films or TV or documentaries, tell me where you got it from. If it's from reading Private Peaceful in English, tell me that's where it's from, just so I can find out how you know your information, where it's from. Extension tasks to go along with that. Explain why so many countries were involved in fighting during World War One. So it's a bit of a recap on the stuff we've just gone through. Again, pause the video, press play when you're ready to move on to the next section. So, I'm going to read to you a couple of quotes from this book from David Alsoga on the World's War, which talks about forgotten soldiers of the British Empire. 70 million men, were mobilised during the First World War. 4 million non-white, non-European soldiers fought for Britain, France and their allies. Seeing the First World War as the World's War is, at one level, about recovering those stories and those perspectives. So it's all about remembering these forgotten stories almost, bringing them back into public memory. Because as we'll look at now, there's quite a traditional narrative of what World War One is like. The historical war has been overwhelmed by what the historian David Reynolds has called the literary war, a popular memory of the conflict formed from the collected fragments of prose and war poetry. So in this extract, David Alsoga is saying that World War One has been caught up in what David Reynolds calls a literary war, so all about memory based on pieces of text and poetry. So a lot of you will have looked at Private Peaceful, and this would fall under this category that David Reynolds pronounces as a literary war. So these stories quite often are very, very focused on European involvement in World War One. But as we saw from the first extract, 4 million non-white, non-European soldiers fought for Britain, France and their allies during the World War One. So we're going to be trying to get away from these typical and traditional views of World War One being so heavily European focused, which is what a lot of the literature and a lot of the poetry and even a lot of the documentaries and films focus on. Some of you might have seen 1917, very much focused on European involvement during the war. So over the next few weeks we're going to try and sort of dispel that myth that World War One's all about Europeans, and white people fighting, because it wasn't. It just wasn't true. So based on these two extracts, I want you to complete this next task. 2 questions and an extension. Firstly, what does David Alsoga suggest is the reason we mainly focus on the European narrative of World War One? So why is it that our minds are preoccupied with just looking at Europeans? So particularly look at that second extract for that one, particularly with what David Reynolds was saying about World War One. Second question, why is this focus on Europeans an unfair narrative of World War One as a whole? So why is it not fair that this narrative that's traditionally used for World War One is so focused on white Europeans? What is that missing out? Who is being missed out? Why is that not fair? So for those 2 questions, I want you to make sure you're using evidence from David Alsoga to back up your points. So try and include a quote and explain how it backs you up. Again, as usual, I expect full sentences answering the question, not just short answers. Finally, as an extension, how do you think we can go about challenging this traditional view of World War One? So how can we, as a new generation, move away from this traditional view of European focused war? Okay, so that is your final task for today. Pause the video there. When you're finished, just press play for the final little bit before you head off. So, this is just a quick look at who fought for Britain during World War One. As you can see there, 5 million soldiers belonging to Britain. You've got 1.5 million from India, over 600,000 from Canada, 400,000 from Australia, and then South Africa and New Zealand, over 100,000 from each of those. And then finally at the bottom, other colonies provided around 130,000 people. Other colonies mainly being places like the Caribbean islands, like Jamaica sent a lot of troops in, and the West Indies also sending lots of troops in. So, over these next few weeks, you might have gathered, we are going to be looking at different people who fought for Britain during during World War One, not just focusing on white males. So we're going to be looking at soldiers from India, soldiers from Algeria, soldiers from the Caribbean, women enlisters. We're going to be looking at a broad range of people who were involved for Britain during World War One. Thank you for watching. Remember to send your work in via Teams as usual. See you again soon.